They say some sounds do not belong to the living. A whisper behind a closed door, a knock in the dead of night, a bell that should have stopped ringing long ago. Welcome to Whispers of Asia, where forgotten legends breathe beneath old soil and the past is never truly silent. In every village, every mountain, every quiet home, there are stories, not written, not spoken, but remembered in shivers, in shadows, and in silence. Stories passed down in trembling voices, stories that linger like the scent of burnt incense, stories that do not end even when the last word is spoken. Tonight, we follow one such whisper. This is the story of a cursed shrine, a buried soul, and a bell that never stops ringing. The train to Shizuoka cut through the countryside like a silver thread unraveling through fabric soaked in fog. It was early spring, but the sky carried the dull gray of a fading winter, the kind of color that made everything feel suspended, paused, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Aika leaned her forehead against the cool window, watching as the city gave way to fields and forest, each mile pulling her further from the world she'd tried to forget and deeper into the one that had never truly let her go. Her reflection in the glass looked older than she remembered. Tired eyes, quiet mouth, a woman shaped by goodbyes that had never been said properly. It had been 10 years since she left, maybe more, and yet the land hadn't changed. Not really. The announcement came in a robotic voice. Next stop, Nishimari Station. She sighed. One stop away. The last stop. Her grandmother's call had come just 3 days ago, or rather, a nurse had called on her behalf. The old woman had grown weaker, confused. Sometimes she forgot to eat. Sometimes she wandered into the woods behind the house and had to be found by neighbors. Aika hadn't hesitated. She packed a bag that night and told work she'd be gone indefinitely. Indefinitely. That word had its own quiet weight. The train squealed as it slowed, coming to a gentle stop at a platform that looked more like a forgotten wooden bench than a station. No one got off but her. No one got on. And when the train slid away, it took with it the last thread of noise, leaving her standing alone with her suitcase and the gentle hum of wind through the trees. Aika took a breath, filling her lungs with air that smelt like wet soil and old wood, the kind of smell she used to associate with childhood summers and stories her grandmother would whisper into her ear when the lights were off. Stories about fox spirits and faceless women who waited by wells. Back then, she'd believed everything. And maybe she still did, just differently. She walked. The road that led up the mountain was narrow, framed by cedars so tall they blotted out the sun. Shadows layered over shadows. Moss clung to the trunks like forgotten prayers. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. Her footsteps softened on the dirt path. No birds, no insects, only the wind, as if the woods were listening. At last, the house came into view. It looked smaller than she remembered, a wooden structure nestled between trees, its tiled roof sagging slightly at the edges. The paint had peeled, the veranda was cluttered with forgotten things, an old watering can, a broken lantern, a stack of yellowed newspapers. But it was still home, somehow. Aika stepped onto the porch. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and before she could knock, the door slid open with a slow groan. Her grandmother stood there, tiny, thinner than Aika remembered. Her hair had turned to white ash, her back more hunched than ever, but her eyes, those cloudy, sharp eyes, still held the same storm behind them. Aika, she said. No smile, just a name, as if tasting it for the first time. I'm here now, Oba-san. There was a pause. Then her grandmother turned and walked inside without another word. Aika followed. The house smelled like cedar and something older, dust, herbs, and the faint sweetness of incense that had burned out long ago. Everything looked the same, the tatami mats, the altar with its tiny porcelain figures, the faded scroll of calligraphy hanging in the hallway. Only the air felt different, heavier, as if it were filled with something unseen. She set her suitcase down beside the door. Her grandmother had already sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap. You shouldn't have come, the old woman said without looking at her. Aika blinked. What? You've been gone too long, and you're too late. The words sank into her like stones. I came because you needed help. Her grandmother shook her head slowly. I didn't ask for help. I asked for silence, and now you've stirred it. Aika opened her mouth to speak, but said nothing. The quiet that followed felt older than either of them. They ate in silence that night. Rice and pickled radish, miso soup with too much salt. Her grandmother barely touched her food. She seemed to stare beyond the walls, toward something only she could see. And when Aika offered to clean, the old woman simply stood and said, Don't go near the shrine. It came out of nowhere, no explanation, just that. The shrine? Her grandmother didn't answer. She shuffled away, her footsteps whispering down the hallway like wind through dry leaves. Aika sloped on a futon laid out in the guest room. The air was cold. The moonlight filtered in through slatted windows, tracing pale lines across the tatami. She couldn't sleep. Not really. Every creak of the house felt like it carried intention. Every shifting breeze outside sounded like breath. And then she heard it. Soft, distant, a bell. Faint and far away, as if someone were gently ringing it in the forest behind the house. At first she thought she imagined it, but it came again, soft and slow, like a heartbeat made of metal. Chime, chime, chime. She sat up. Her grandmother's voice came from somewhere beyond the wall, cracked and brittle like old bone. Don't follow the bell. That's not a sound for the living. Aika didn't move. Outside, the bell kept ringing. Inside, the silence held its breath. And something, deep within her, began to listen. Morning arrived pale and uncertain, spilling a thin light through the paper screens of Aika's room. The first thing she heard was not birds or wind, but the faint echo of the bell still ringing somewhere beyond the trees. Softer now, as if it had been ringing all night and was finally growing tired. She rose from the futon, feeling the tatami cool beneath her bare feet. Her grandmother was already awake. The smell of tea drifted from the kitchen, earthy and faintly bitter. When Aika entered, the old woman was kneeling by the low table, pouring tea into 2 cups, her eyes fixed on nothing. You heard it, didn't you? She said. Aika sat slowly. The bell? A curt nod. It starts as a whisper. That's how it finds you. Her grandmother's hands trembled as she set the teapot down. This place, people don't talk about it openly, not anymore, but it remembers. She lifted her eyes to Aika. You should leave before it knows your name. Aika stared back, unsettled by the words. Oba-san, I'm here for you. I'm not leaving. The old woman's mouth drew a thin line. Then at least remember this. You do not go near the shrine. You do not answer the sound, and you do not speak its true name aloud." "The shrine has a name?" A pause. Then softly, "Kane no Sato." The words rolled through the room like a gust of cold air. Aika didn't know why, but she felt her stomach tighten. The Bell Village? Her grandmother looked at her sharply. "Never call it that again." Aika didn't press. They drank their tea in silence, and when she stepped outside to clear her head, the forest seemed to lean closer around the house, its branches whispering like thin fingers brushing together. She decided to walk. The path behind the house was narrow, bordered by moss-covered stones half swallowed by the earth. It wound upward through cedar and pine, the air damp and cool. Every few steps, she caught a glimmer of something hanging from the trees, faded paper charms tied to twigs, strips of cloth frayed to threads. She wondered who had placed them and when. They looked old, older than her grandmother. The further she went, the less she heard of the world. No cicadas, no crows, only the soft crunch of her footsteps and, far away, the suggestion of a bell. She followed a bend in the path and stopped. Ahead stood the shrine. It was smaller than she expected, almost swallowed by the forest. The roof sagged under decades of fallen needles. The wooden steps were warped and dark with rot. Thick ropes of shiminawa hung across the entrance like sleeping serpents, their once white zigzag paper charms browned and curled. A line of ofuda plastered the door, so many overlapping that it looked like scales on some ancient creature. The air was heavy here, not just still, heavy, as though she had stepped underwater. She didn't move closer. She only stared, her heart thudding. There was no bell in sight, no sign of anyone. And yet, as she stood there, she felt it again, a faint vibration in her chest, like the echo of a sound she couldn't hear properly. Her fingers twitched. The legend her grandmother had told her the night before floated up in her memory. A woman buried alive beneath the shrine, a bell tied to her hand, ringing for the living. A chill moved down Aika's spine. She took a step back, then another. The trees creaked as if shifting. She turned and walked back down the path, forcing herself not to look over her shoulder. By the time she returned to the house, her hands were cold. Her grandmother was waiting on the veranda, staring into the forest. She didn't ask where Aika had gone. She only said, "You look pale." "I went for a walk." "You heard it again, didn't you?" Aika didn't answer. The old woman's eyes softened with something like sorrow. "It's always curious ones. The bell knows how to call them." That night, the sound came closer. Aika lay awake on her futon, listening. The bell wasn't in the forest anymore. It was at the edge of the house, faint but steady, as though someone stood outside, ringing it softly, rhythmically, waiting. Chime, chime, chime. Her breath caught. She rose slowly, sliding the screen open just enough to peer out. Moonlight poured over the garden, silvering the stones in the low pond. The trees beyond were black silhouettes. Nothing moved, and yet the sound continued. Her grandmother's voice drifted from the hallway, thin and cracked like old paper. "Close the window." Aika shut it quickly, hands trembling. "Obasan!" "Don't follow the bell," the old woman whispered. The bell went on. It sounded like patience. It sounded like it had all the time in the world. And for the first time, Aika wondered if it had already found her. It rained the next morning. A cold, silent rain that fell like memory, soft, constant, and impossible to ignore. It pattered against the roof tiles like fingers tapping gently at the edge of thought. Aika sat by the window, watching droplets chase one another down the glass. The air inside the house felt damp, the tatami mat slightly swollen beneath her toes. Her grandmother hadn't come out of her room, not since speaking those words the night before. "That's not a sound for the living." The way she said it, not with fear, but with knowing, stayed in Aika's bones. She boiled water for tea, just as her grandmother always did, and placed a cup outside her door. "Oba-san," she said softly, "you should drink something." No answer, only the creak of old wood settling. Aika left the cup and stepped outside. The rain hadn't touched the ground directly. The canopy overhead was thick, shielding the forest floor in a dim, dripping twilight. It smelled of cedar and wet earth, and something older underneath, like forgotten incense or the inside of a shut box that had once held bones. She didn't mean to walk back to the shrine, not consciously, but her feet moved that way anyway, like something in the soil itself was drawing her forward. The path was slick with moss and old pine needles. She moved slowly, carefully. And then the shrine came into view again. Still small, still broken, still wrapped in its noose of silence. But this time, she stepped closer. The ropes that hung across the doorway, the shimenawa, were thicker than she remembered. Once vibrant with white paper lightning charms, they were now dulled and frayed, damp with age. Mold clung to them like rot. She reached out a hand, hesitated, and touched the rope with her fingertips. It was damp, rough. It pulsed faintly, like it was still holding something in. Aika swallowed. She stepped around to the side of the shrine. The wood paneling was weathered, some planks warped and broken, revealing slivers of darkness inside. At the rear corner, she found what looked like an old offering bowl, charred black and half buried in leaves. She knelt, brushing it off. The inside was filled with ash, thin, fine, gray-white ash that clung to her fingers like flour. She stared at it. Beside the bowl was something else. A flat, moss-covered stone with kanji carved into its surface. The characters were faded, but she could make them out. Chin-kon, repose of souls. It wasn't a prayer. It was a warning. She stood quickly, wiping her hands on her coat. A sudden gust of wind stirred the trees above, and for a moment she thought she heard something. Not the bell, but something else. A rustling beneath the floorboards of the shrine, a shifting weight, like something turning over in the dark. Aika stepped back, and then the bell rang. Once, soft, distant, but not from the forest anymore, not from the path behind the house. It came from inside the shrine. She froze. The rope swayed faintly. Another chime. Then silence. Aika turned and ran. She didn't stop until she reached the clearing behind her grandmother's house, her breath fogging in the cold air, her hands trembling. The house looked different now, smaller, less like a home, more like a memory with its corners curling inward. Inside, the tea was still untouched outside her grandmother's door. Aika knocked gently. "Oba-san." No answer. She pushed the door open a crack. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle flickering on the altar. Her grandmother sat cross-legged on the floor, her back to the door, facing the small wooden kamidana shelf where family spirits were honored. She didn't turn around. "You went there again," she said softly. Aika hesitated. "I just looked. I didn't go in." "You touched the rope?" A pause. "Yes." "Then it knows you now. It knows your weight, your voice, your scent." Aika stepped inside, the candlelight dancing against the walls. What is it really? What's inside that shrine? Her grandmother didn't speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Once, long ago, there was a girl who was born during the year of stone and fire. A cursed year, they called it. A year where water drowned the crops and sickness took the children. The elders said the gods were angry, that someone had to be given to quiet the mountain." Aika's heart beat in her throat. A sacrifice? She was buried alive beneath the shrine, hands bound, bell tied to her wrist so that the gods would hear her suffering and spare the rest. The candle flickered. But the gods did not come, only the dark. Aika felt her heart beating in her throat. She rings the bell when she's hungry, when she's lonely, when the seal weakens. She calls to those who listen. Her grandmother turned then, and her eyes were filled with something deeper than fear, something like guilt. "And now she's calling you." That night, Aika couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the wind carried whispers through the trees. The sound of branches tapping against the windows was steady, like knuckles knocking in a rhythm. Her room felt smaller, the shadows longer. Every creak of the house sent her nerves alight. Then, around midnight, she heard it again, the bell, only this time, it didn't sound distant. It sounded close, in the house, not beneath the floorboards, not from the forest, but somewhere behind the walls. She rose from the futon, heart pounding. The sound stopped as soon as her feet touched the floor. She tiptoed toward the hallway, her hand trailing the paper screen. The house was silent. She turned the corner and stopped. There, at the end of the hallway, the altar cabinet door stood open. The candle inside had gone out, and in the dust before the kamidana, someone had drawn a single, perfect circle with their finger. Right in the center was a tiny, rusted bell. The bell was still there when morning came. Aika hadn't touched it. She hadn't even dared to breathe too close to it. The tiny rusted thing sat perfectly still in the dust before the altar, as though it had always been there, as though it belonged more than she did. Her grandmother didn't mention it. She simply closed the cabinet door, swept the floor in silence, and lit fresh incense. Not a word, but her hands trembled as she lit the flame. Aika sat across from her, staring at the rising smoke curling in soft gray spirals. "Obasan, what does it mean? The bell in the altar?" She didn't look up. It's her way in, one chime at a time. "Why now?" "Because you're here." Aika said nothing. Outside, the forest pressed closer. That evening she dreamed of the earth. Not the sky, not the trees, just the earth. She stood in a deep hole, the soil crumbling beneath her feet. The walls were wet, black with rot, and the only light came from a flickering candle held by a figure above, just beyond reach. "Please," Aika called up. Her voice echoed like it didn't belong to her. The figure didn't move, just watched. Then the candle went out, and the sound began. A bell, ringing slow, steady, and near. Chime, chime, chime. She turned in the darkness. There was someone behind her. A woman, hair matted with mud, skin the color of grave cloth. Her wrists were bound, and from one hand, impossibly still, hung a tiny bell. Her mouth didn't move, but Aika heard her voice. "It's your turn now." She woke with a scream caught in her throat. The room was dark, but not silent. The bell was ringing again. Only this time, it wasn't in her dream. It was behind the wall, inside the wall. She sat up, heart racing. The sound was faint but unmistakable. A soft, deliberate chime spaced out like a heartbeat, as though someone were walking slowly through the house, letting the bell sway with each step. She reached for the lamp, but the switch didn't work. The bulb stayed dark. The hallway outside was silent. She pressed her ear to the wall, her breath fogged against the wooden panel. Nothing at first. Then, chime, right behind the wall. She stumbled back. The next morning, she tore the room apart. She searched behind every panel, checked every crack in the floorboards, but there was no bell, no hidden wires, nothing. Only dust, old wood, and silence. Her grandmother watched her from the doorway, holding a cup of tea she didn't drink. "You can't find it, because it's not a thing. It's a calling." Aika stood, brushing the dust from her knees. "Then tell me how to stop it." The old woman turned and walked away. Later, Aika returned to the shrine. She didn't tell herself she was going. She didn't plan it. Her feet just carried her, like a needle drawn to thread. The path was darker than before. The trees seemed taller, their branches overlapping like ribs. The forest didn't feel alive. It felt waiting. When the shrine appeared between the trees, she stopped. The ropes were still there, but the door was open. Only a crack, but open. She approached slowly. The smell hit her first, something like wet soil and rusted iron, sweet and metallic. She stepped closer, peering into the gap. Inside it was dark, unnaturally dark, the kind that swallowed daylight like a mouth. But in that dark she saw something. A figure, kneeling, hair draped over its face, white kimono stained brown with age, head bowed, hands bound in front. On one hand, a bell. It didn't move, but the bell did. It rang once, without the hand shifting at all. Chime. Aika staggered back. The figure raised its head. No face, only skin stretched over emptiness like wax melting over bone. Aika turned and ran. She didn't stop until she collapsed on the grass near her grandmother's house, gasping for air, the sound of the bell still echoing in her skull like it had moved inside her. That night, her grandmother finally told her the rest. "There was no flood," she said quietly. "No angry gods. That was the lie they told." Aika sat across from her, pale and silent. She was just a girl, a shrine maiden, the priest's daughter. She fell in love with a traveler, someone from outside the village. When the elders found out, they said she had defiled the sacred ground. Her hands trembled as she sipped her tea. So they buried her, alive, said her suffering would cleanse the land. Who was she? Her grandmother looked down. Her name was Mizue. The name felt heavy in the room, like it didn't want to be spoken. They tied a bell to her wrist so they'd know if she tried to escape. Every night it rang, for days, then weeks, until finally it stopped. Aika's voice was a whisper. "Because she died?" Her grandmother nodded. "But sometimes the bell rings again." Aika's throat tightened. "Why?" The old woman looked at her. "To find a replacement." The room fell into silence.
Outside, the forest sighed, and in the walls something shifted. Aika didn't sleep that night. She didn't even try. She sat by the altar, candle lit, bell in hand, waiting. But the bell didn't ring. Instead, the mirror in the hallway fogged from the inside. And when she approached it, slowly, carefully, she saw a second reflection standing behind her.
The attic had always been a place of shadows. As a child, Aika had never dared to go up there. It was the one place her grandmother never cleaned, never entered, never mentioned. The ladder was hidden behind a sliding wall panel, tucked behind the altar cabinet, and covered in cobwebs so thick they looked like gauze. But that morning, something called her there. Not a sound, not a dream, just a stillness in the house that didn't feel right, like the silence was hiding something. She slid the panel open. The ladder creaked under her weight, each rung moaning like an old throat trying to speak. The space above was dark, the air dry and thick with dust. Only a small window under the eaves let in a sliver of light, enough to reveal the outlines of forgotten things, boxes, furniture draped in white sheets, bundles of old newspapers bound with twine. Aika coughed as she stepped forward. The air smelled like incense and mildew, something ancient, something closed for too long. She found it in the far corner. A wooden chest, blackened with age, its iron clasps rusted. Something about it felt wrong, as if it wasn't just a box, but a wound that had never healed. She knelt, hesitating before placing her hands on the lid. It was colder than the air around it. The lock was broken. The lid lifted with a reluctant groan, like something exhaling after being trapped too long. Inside, a stack of folded cloth, a yellowed scroll tied in string, and a journal. The pages were brittle, ink faded, but the script was beautiful, delicate, disciplined brushstrokes of a hand long dead. She turned to the first page. The gods demand silence, but I must write, because silence cannot hold the weight of what we've done. Her hands shook slightly as she turned the pages. They chose her because she was pure. That's what they said, but purity was never what they wanted. They wanted obedience. They wanted a scapegoat. Mizue never cried, even when they bound her wrists, even when they tied the bell. We told ourselves it would save us, that if she rang the bell long enough, the gods would forgive us. But there were no gods listening. Only her. Only her. The next few pages were stained with water damage, or tears, impossible to read. Aika's heart pounded as she turned to the last legible entry. It's been 14 days. The bell still rings at night. No one goes near the shrine. The ropes are fraying. The seals have faded. I see her in my dreams now, her mouth sewn shut, her hands reaching, her bell. The bell has begun again. And then nothing. The ink stopped mid-sentence. The rest of the page was blank. Aika stared at it for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old window pane. Something shifted behind her, a faint scuttling across the attic floor. She turned quickly. No one, but a whisper curled into her ear like breath. She remembers you. Aika slammed the journal shut. That night, she placed the book on the altar, lit 3 sticks of incense, whispered a prayer she didn't know how to finish. But the bell rang anyway. 3 times, evenly spaced, measured, calm. Chime, chime, chime.
She didn't scream. She simply walked to the hallway mirror, the one that had fogged from the inside. It was clear now, but her reflection blinked slower than she did. Her reflection moved its lips without sound, and then smiled. The next morning, Aika confronted her grandmother. She held the journal in her lap as they sat together on the veranda, the forest still and watching around them. "I found it," she said quietly, "the record of what they did to her." Her grandmother didn't turn. "She was 16, Aika continued. "She trusted them, and they buried her alive." The old woman's voice cracked. "I know. Then why didn't anyone dig her up? Why didn't anyone stop it?" "Because they believed the lie, that one girl suffering could save everyone." "And you still believe that?" The old woman shook her head. "No, but the curse doesn't care what we believe." Aika's voice broke. "Obasan, she's not just angry, she's in pain." Her grandmother's eyes met hers, and for the first time Aika saw something that terrified her more than any ghost. Resignation. "She's always in pain, that's the point." Aika stood. She walked back into the house, past the altar, past the old photographs, past the hallway mirror, where her reflection still lingered a moment too long. She walked to her room and pulled the covers from the floorboards. She was going to find where the bell was coming from. She was going to dig. The tatami lifted with effort, stiff from years of silence. Beneath, the wooden subfloor groaned. She pried up a plank, then another. Dust choked the air. And then earth, packed black soil, pressed flat by generations. She dug with her hands. The dirt was cold, damp. It went deeper than it should have. And then her fingers touched something metal. She pulled, a length of string. At the end, a small, rusted bell. Still tied, still warm. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the middle of the room, bell in hand, waiting. When the shadows lengthened, when the wind stilled, when the mirror in the hallway began to fog, she didn't look away. She looked straight into it. And in the reflection, she saw herself. But beneath her skin was someone else. A girl in a white kimono, hair soaked with soil, mouth sewn shut, and a bell tied to her hand. She didn't move, but the bell did. Chime, chime, chime. And in Aika's hand, her own bell began to ring in perfect unison.
It started with the mirror. Every morning now, Aika found it fogged over, even when the air was dry, even when there was no breath but her own. And each time there was something new written in the condensation. Not words, not symbols, circles. Small, perfect circles, drawn with a single finger. Always in the same place, always the same size as a bell. Her grandmother refused to speak of it. She barely spoke at all anymore. She moved slowly through the house like a fading shadow, lighting incense at dawn and dusk, scattering salt across the thresholds, muttering prayers in a language Aika didn't recognize. Her eyes were distant now, not just tired, but as if she was already halfway gone, as though some part of her had retreated to the past and refused to return. Aika felt the silence closing in. The journal she had found in the attic stayed with her now, tucked into her bag, never out of reach.
She read it over and over, trying to find meaning in the margins, in the gaps between brushstrokes, in the last unfinished sentence. The bell has begun again. It was never really about the sound. It was about the choice. That night, the air inside the house changed. It grew heavy. Not cold, not warm, just dense, like the walls had drawn a breath and were waiting to exhale. Aika lay awake, listening to the stillness. Then faintly, beneath the floor, came a sound. Not the bell, something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, bare feet pressing into earth and wood. She froze. They moved from one side of the house to the other, circling beneath her, pacing as if searching for the thinnest point in the floor, the weakest place to rise through. She rose quietly, avoiding the creaking boards. She stepped into the hallway, heart hammering. The mirror was not fogged this time. It was cracked. Just one thin line, diagonal, running from corner to corner like a fracture in time. Her reflection was split, her face slightly displaced, as if one part of her had already begun to slip away. Behind her, she heard the soft groan of a floorboard. She turned. No one. But the air shifted, and the scent of damp earth filled the hallway. She knew that smell now. Grave soil. She backed into her room and shut the door, her hands shaking. In the morning, her grandmother was gone. The front door stood open, rain blowing in. Her sandals were missing. Aika ran into the woods. The forest swallowed her quickly, the trees tall and wet and whispering. She called her grandmother's name again and again, but the only reply was wind and the soft, persistent sound of rain dripping from the leaves. She found her at the shrine, kneeling, not in prayer, but in surrender. The ropes across the shrine's entrance had been cut, clean, severed. The door stood wide open now. Inside, only darkness. Her grandmother turned slowly to face her. Her eyes were hollow, but not empty. They were filled with something old, something that remembered pain like a song it could never stop singing. I tried to hold it back. I tried to keep it sealed, Aika asked, her voice cracking. The old woman shook her head. No, I remembered. That was enough. She held something out in her hand, a small piece of fabric, torn, white with red stitching. It was a piece of Mizue's kimono. I was there, Aika, when they buried her. I was a child, but I watched. I said nothing. Tears filled Aika's eyes. She doesn't want revenge, the old woman whispered. She wants release. They walked back together. But that night, her grandmother did not speak. She sat by the altar, staring at the flame, until her eyes closed, not in sleep, but in stillness. And Aika realized she wasn't breathing. The funeral was quiet, just Aika and the village priest. The villagers did not come. No one offered condolences. The priest placed the coins on her grandmother's eyes and whispered the final rites, his voice tight with fear. Before he left, He handed Aika a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, old and faded. A girl with long hair, pale skin, eyes closed in a solemn pose. Her wrists were bound, and tied to one hand was a bell. On the back, a single word was written in careful ink: Mizue. That night, the bell did not ring. It sang. Long, mournful chimes that seemed to echo through the walls, the floor, the bones of the house itself. Aika sat in the middle of the room, the journal open before her, the photo beside it. And from beneath the floor, she heard breathing. Shallow, rhythmic, as if someone were lying there, waiting. And when she pressed her palm to the floor, it was warm.
Mizue, a name once whispered in reverence, then in fear, now only in silence. The photograph trembled slightly in Aika's hands as she stared at the girl bound in ceremonial white, not angry, not pleading, just still, like she had accepted the soil before it ever touched her skin. The village priest hadn't said a word when he handed it over. He didn't meet Aika's eyes, just bowed low and left quickly, as if lingering too long would pull him under with her. She placed the photograph on the altar beside her grandmother's ashes. The candlelight danced across Mizue's face. Not a monster, not a curse. A girl. The days after the funeral passed in shadows. The villagers no longer spoke to Aika. When she walked to the edge of the road for groceries or mail, they looked away. Some closed their doors when she approached. Others offered brief, cold nods, more habit than respect. She overheard one of them whisper, "She's marked now." Another said, "It's begun again." Aika stopped asking questions. She turned inward, toward the house, toward the shrine, toward the bell that now rang only for her. One evening, she found an old cedar box in her grandmother's closet, beneath layers of linen, behind stacks of untouched robes. Inside, a bundle of letters, tied together with red thread. No stamps, no envelopes, just folded parchment, yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was the same across them all, elegant, feminine brushstrokes, Mizue's hand. They weren't addressed to anyone. They were confessions. I was never meant to become a priestess, but my father insisted. He said women must serve the mountain in silence, that our blood could wash the sins of men. But my voice was never meant for prayers, only for love. He found out about the boy from the other village, about our secret meetings by the river. He didn't speak, he didn't shout, he simply looked at me like I was already dead. And then they prepared the shrine. Aika's hands trembled. She read every page, every word, slowly, carefully. They had painted Mizue as sacred, a chosen maiden, blessed to carry the village's sins. But in truth, she had been condemned for something far simpler: desire. That night, Aika lit incense and whispered to the dark. She said, "I know your name now." She closed her eyes. "I know who you were, and I'm sorry." She waited, and in the silence, something shifted. Not outside, inside her. She began to dream more vividly, not of fear, not of death, but of Mizue's life. She stood barefoot in the river, the sun warm on her skin. She smelled plum blossoms in the wind. She laughed,
a sound Aika had never heard in the dream world before, and beside her, a boy with ink-stained fingers held her hand. Then, a rope, a bell, a box made of wood and dirt and silence. The dreams bled into waking. Aika caught glimpses of Mizue's face reflected in puddles, in windows, in spoons, always half-shadowed, always watching. Sometimes she heard a voice behind her, not a whisper, but a breath forming a word. Her name. Aika. Soft, sad, familiar. One evening she returned to the shrine. She wasn't afraid anymore. The door stood open now, wide and still. The ropes had fallen completely. The seals were curled and faded, clinging by threads. Inside, the scent of old earth and rotting incense filled the air. She stepped in. The floor creaked beneath her weight. The walls felt close, as if the space had shrunk around her. At the center, the altar was gone. In its place, a sunken square, about the size of a coffin. The earth was still soft, recently disturbed. Aika knelt down. She reached down, brushing the dirt away with her fingers. A piece of white cloth, a rusted nail, a single black hair, and beneath all that, a smooth stone etched with a single kanji. Ku, suffering. She traced it with her fingers. Behind her, she heard footsteps. She turned. No one, but a bell sat on the step where none had been before, and next to it, her grandmother's rosary. Back at the house, Aika found the mirror shattered, not cracked, shattered. The pieces lay in a perfect circle on the floor, as if arranged by unseen hands. In each shard, her reflection blinked at a different time. Some smiled, some wept. One was looking over her shoulder. That evening, she opened the final drawer of her grandmother's altar cabinet, the one that had always been locked. Inside, a lacquered box with a faded emblem, the same symbol carved into the shrine floor. Inside the box, a second journal. This one not written by Mizue, but by her father, the priest. Did not want to bury her, but I believed it was the only way to save the village. I sealed her soul with the bell, but her voice still reaches through. She never screams, she never begs, she only waits. Each generation, she chooses one, and now the bell has begun again. Aika closed the book and wept, not just for Mizue, but for herself, because she now knew she was not being haunted, she was being remembered. That night, as the wind howled through the forest, Aika lit a single candle in front of the altar. She placed Mizue's photo beside it and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." The flame flickered once, and in the corner of the room, a bell rang. Not softly, but with joy. The sound of the bell followed Aika into her dreams now. Not sharp, not urgent, but constant. Like a lullaby played with rusted bones. It no longer startled her awake. Instead, it cradled her in a sleep that felt deeper than dreaming. She woke with the bell still echoing behind her eyes. The shrine didn't resist her anymore. She walked its path each day, sometimes in daylight, sometimes beneath the full weight of the moon. The forest no longer tried to warn her. The wind no longer whispered. The silence had become a welcome companion. The door to the shrine stayed open now, always. as if waiting for someone it had already chosen. Inside, the earth remained soft, breathing, and in her chest, Aika felt something shift. She returned to the attic. The box where she'd found Mizue's journal had something else buried beneath the lining, tucked between the baseboards, folded into a hidden compartment. A scroll, small, bound in red string. She unrolled it slowly. A list of names, all women, all born in the Tsuchinoe years, the year of earth and metal. Her year. She read each name aloud, whispers fragile as candle smoke. Some she recognized from the village grave markers, some from her grandmother's stories, others were strangers lost to time. Beside each name, a date, not of birth, of disappearance. One name per generation, always a girl, always around her age. At the bottom of the scroll was the most recent name, Fujimura Aika. No date beside it yet, just space, waiting. She stared at it for a long time, her breath shallow, her hands cold. Later, she sat before her grandmother's altar, the scroll laid out before her like a confession. How long did you know? How long was this planned? The candles flickered, but gave no answer. And yet she knew. This wasn't a random haunting. It was a cycle. And she was next. The priest came the next day. He didn't knock, just appeared at the edge of the garden, eyes tired, robes damp from the mist. "I heard the bell," he said softly. Aika didn't ask how or why now. He stepped inside and sat across from her at the low table. "They told us the sacrifice was chosen by the gods, but it was always the bell. The bell chooses. It hums inside the bones of the one it wants. That's why you feel it, why you dream." Aika nodded. "I found the scroll," she said. He closed his eyes. "Then you understand." "I don't want to." He looked at her, a sadness deep in his features. None of them did. That night, the bell rang inside her room, not in the walls, not in the floorboards, but inside the space itself. She lit no candles. She didn't move. She sat cross-legged in the dark, the bell clutched in her hand. It was warm now. Not from fire, from something deeper, older, alive. She dreamed of the others, the girls before her. She saw them one by one, in fields, by rivers, under trees, each one touched by silence, each one drawn to the shrine, not forced, not dragged, called. They hadn't screamed, they had simply gone. In the morning, she found a ring of ash on her floor, perfectly circular. Inside it, her name carved in small, careful strokes, over and over. Aika, Aika, Aika. The mirror was gone. Not broken, not shattered, just missing, as if the house had swallowed it. She spoke to Mizue aloud now, not through dreams, not through whispers, but like a sister, like someone she'd known her whole life but only just remembered. "I know what they did to you," she said one evening, standing in the shrine, candle in hand. "I know they made you a vessel for their shame." She knelt, pressing her hand to the dirt. "I won't run." The ground was warm beneath her fingers, and in the shadows she heard Mizue's voice, not as breath, but as song. Back in the house, she flipped through her grandmother's journal one final time. At the very end, beneath a loose page, she found one last note. It was not dated. It was not signed. Just a sentence. I couldn't stop it, but maybe you can choose how it ends. That night, Aika wrapped the bell in white cloth. She placed it beneath her pillow, and she slept like someone whose name had already been spoken by the earth.
There was a rhythm in the silence now. Not music, not noise, but something deeper, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. A slow, pulsing cadence that echoed through the floors, the trees, the walls of Aika's chest. She didn't need to listen for the bell anymore. She carried it with her. In her grandmother's drawer, beneath folded talismans and brittle charms, Aika found a parchment older than anything else in the house. Its edges crumbled at her touch, and the ink had bled in places, but the shape was clear. A kagura, a sacred dance, but not for worship, for binding, for mourning, for replacing. The scroll was annotated in her grandmother's hand, and beneath that, in a shakier, ancient script, were the names of those who had danced it before. All women, all marked. Aika's name was not written yet, but she could feel the space waiting for her. She prepared in silence. There were no instructions for the music, only a pattern of steps, of hand movements, of where to pause and where to kneel. She wore white, the color of death, the color of surrender, the color Mizue had worn when she went into the ground. The shrine watched her as she stepped inside. The air was thicker now, as if the space itself remembered every movement that had ever been performed there. She stood at the center. The earth beneath her feet felt soft, ready. She closed her eyes, and she danced. It began slowly, each movement guided by instinct more than memory, as if someone else's hands were gently placed over hers. She raised her arms, turned, knelt. Dust stirred around her in slow spirals. The candle flickered, though no wind touched it. Her breath came faster now. Her limbs moved without effort, her body loosening, forgetting itself. She spun once, twice. Then the bell rang, but not the one in her hand, the one beneath the shrine. It answered her. Step by step, the world folded around her. The candlelight grew red, then gold, then gone. Darkness bloomed like ink in water, and behind her eyes something opened. She was no longer Aika. She was standing on soil, bound in white, staring up at the sky for the last time. Men chanted, women wept, not in sorrow, but in fear. Her wrists were bound, a bell tied to her skin. They lowered her into the earth, and she did not scream. She simply looked at her father and smiled. He looked away. Then they sealed the box. Aika gasped as she collapsed to the floor. Her knees hit the dirt with a soft thud. The dance was over, but the echo remained in her limbs, in her throat, in the sting of soil behind her eyes. The shrine was silent until a voice whispered from behind the paper wall. You did it wrong. Aika turned. No one there, but the candle had gone out. That night, her dreams were not her own. She floated above the shrine, watching the earth move in waves. Beneath the surface, Mizue's body shifted, not decomposed, not decayed, preserved. Her mouth was sewn shut, her hands were folded over her stomach, and the bell still hung from her wrist, ringing faintly, in time with Aika's pulse.
She woke to find the white robe still clinging to her skin. But it was no longer white. It was stained with mud. She stood before the mirror that had once been gone, now returned, and in the reflection she saw Mizue standing behind her, not distant, not shadowed, close. Their eyes met, and in that moment Aika didn't feel haunted. She felt inhabited. The priest returned at dawn. He entered the house without a word, eyes sunken, face gray with knowing. He saw the robe, the scroll, the candle burned down to wax. "You danced it," he said. Aika nodded. She came. His shoulders sagged. "Then it's begun, fully. I'm not afraid." He stared at her, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw guilt in his eyes. Not for her, but for all the women before her. "There's still time," he said, "to bind her again." Aika looked out the window, where the fog curled low over the forest path. "She doesn't want to be bound," she said. "She wants to be heard." The priest lowered his gaze and said no more. That evening, the bell rang inside Aika's chest, not near her, not beside her, inside. With every breath, she felt it swinging as if a thread had been tied between her soul and the girl beneath the ground. And as she walked through the house, candles flickering at her passing, she heard Mizue's voice, clear now, no longer distant. "You are the ending I was never given." Aika stood before the shrine once more. She placed the bell on the threshold. She knelt and whispered, "I'm ready." The door opened wider, the earth exhaled, and Mizue stepped forward, not as a ghost, but as a memory made flesh.
The floor had always creaked in her room. Aika once thought it was age or cold, or the sighing of wood remembering footsteps long gone. But now she understood. It wasn't the house breathing, it was the ground beneath it. Something waited there, not a spirit, not a thing, a truth. The ringing in her chest had changed. It wasn't a warning anymore, it was a summons. She followed it like a thread, barefoot across the hallway, candle in hand, until she stood at the center of her room, the place where she had first heard the bell under the floor. She knelt and rolled back the tatami mat. The boards below were warped with moisture. Earth pressed up between the cracks like it had been trying to rise all along. She pried the planks up one by one, the old nails groaning like voices remembering pain. Beneath the wood, dirt, but deeper than dirt, stone. Not natural, carved. She cleared it slowly, brushing away decades of dust with shaking hands. Her fingers found the edge of a hatch, wooden, sealed with a rotted iron clasp. Aika hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She felt it then, a pulse, not hers, something deep, steady, ancient. She opened the hatch. It didn't resist. The air that rose up was damp and cold, smelling of old incense and clay. A staircase descended into shadow, narrow and steep, its edges crumbling from time. She lowered the candle and stepped down. The walls closed in around her like ribs. Each step felt older than the last. She didn't count them, she just walked, until the stairs ended and the chamber opened before her. It was no larger than a single room. The walls were dirt, packed and uneven, with remnants of wood beams embedded like bones in a grave. In the center of the floor lay a rectangle of stone, its surface etched with countless names, some scratched in haste, some carved with care.
She saw her own, Fujimura Aika, fresh, waiting. At the far end of the chamber stood a figure, not moving, not breathing, kneeling. Wrapped in rotted white cloth, long hair pooled on the ground like ink. The face was obscured, not masked, but hidden, as if the room itself protected what lay beneath. The hands were folded over a shallow bowl, and in those hands rested a bell, small, rusted, still, but not silent. It rang once as Aika stepped forward, not loud, but final. She dropped to her knees. Tears filled her eyes, though she didn't feel sadness. She felt recognition. The figure didn't stir, but the air did. It thickened, trembled, and from somewhere beyond the earth, Mizue's voice whispered, not behind her, not above her, from within. "Do you see now?" Aika nodded. "Yes. They gave me silence. You gave me a name." Aika reached out, her fingertips brushing the bell. It was warm. The earth beneath her shifted. A presence moved, not toward her, but through her, like water filling a vessel, like memory flooding a forgotten name. She closed her eyes and saw everything. Mizue's final breath, the moment the lid closed, the years passing like wind over stone, the priests who returned to reinforce the seal, the women who vanished, one by one, the bell ringing in their bones, calling, choosing, repeating. But this time, it paused. This time, it listened. Aika opened her eyes. The bell in Mizue's hand no longer rang. It sat quiet, peaceful, still. The figure began to dissolve, not with fear, not with violence, but with release. The cloth fell away into dust. The bones beneath turned to ash, and the bell slipped from her hand into Aika's. When Aika climbed back up the stairs, the candle was still burning, but the house had changed. It felt lighter, less burdened, less haunted. But she didn't feel free. She felt chosen. And when she looked in the mirror, the one no longer broken, she saw herself, but behind her was no one. For the first time in weeks, the house was truly silent. No footsteps, no breath behind the walls, no ringing. And in that silence, Aika understood. The bell was hers now, not as a curse, but as a key to memory, to grief, to a story that could finally be ended. At first, it was just the small things. She would wake in places she didn't remember falling asleep, the veranda, the foot of the shrine path, once even kneeling before the altar with her palms pressed flat to the floor, as if in prayer. Sometimes her hair was wet, though she hadn't bathed. Sometimes her feet were stained with soil. And the bell, the one she had taken from beneath the earth, now rang without warning, even when she didn't touch it, even when it was locked away. She began to lose time. Hours disappeared. Mornings passed in blinks. Nights unspooled without memory. One day, she found a wooden comb on her pillow, old, carved with the same symbol from the shrine, ku, suffering. Aika didn't recognize it, but her hands did. They knew how to hold it. They moved through her hair and practiced strokes, and when she looked in the mirror, her reflection moved slower than she did. The villagers had stopped speaking to her altogether. When she passed through town, their eyes slid away like oil on water. One woman dropped her offering basket at the sight of her and whispered, "It's her, she's carrying it now." Aika didn't respond. She no longer felt the need to explain. The boundary between herself and Mizue had thinned to a veil, and the veil was wearing through. One evening, Aika woke standing in the woods, the moon high, barefoot. In her hand, a rusted nail. Across her wrist, a faint, fresh line of red. Not deep, not fatal, just enough to tie a bell. She fell to her knees, breath catching in her throat, and screamed into the trees, but no sound came out. Her voice had gone hollow, like it was no longer hers to use. She returned home just before dawn. On the doorstep, laid out like an offering, were her grandmother's old prayer beads and a folded paper charm with her name written on it in red ink. No one had been inside, but every candle had already been lit. She tried to write herself a letter to anchor her mind, to remember who she was. She wrote, "My name is Aika. I am not Mizue. I am not Mizue. I am not Mizue." But when she looked again, the words had changed. "My name is Mizue. I was chosen. I was buried. I am returning." She dropped the pen. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She bound her wrists with ofuda charms. She scattered salt at every door. She tied the bell shut in a box, buried it beneath the plum tree, and swore never to unearth it again. But that night, she woke with it tied around her wrist. It rang as she breathed. In the morning, the priest came, unannounced, uninvited. He looked at her, at the bell on her wrist, the blankness behind her eyes, and he wept. "I'm sorry," he said, falling to his knees. "I should have stopped this." She tilted her head, smiled faintly, but said nothing. Her voice no longer came from her throat. It lived in the bell now. She passed by a group of children outside the general store. They watched her silently. One of them whispered, "She's the new one, isn't she?" Another replied, "No, she's the same one again." Aika kept walking, or perhaps Mizue did. Neither of them flinched. The mirror refused to show her face anymore. It showed trees, rope, a grave, and a girl kneeling inside it, smiling with closed eyes as the lid came down. At sunset, Aito wrote one final entry in her notebook. Her handwriting was clean, deliberate. She wrote, "I am not gone, I am folded into her. She does not want vengeance, she wants release. She chose me because I saw her, not as a curse, but as a girl. And now I will carry her the rest of the way." When night came, the bell no longer rang, it sang, and Aika, or Mizue, walked into the forest, her steps as silent as the roots that waited to receive her.
The house felt emptier now, not abandoned, but hollowed, like something had been carved out of it, quietly, while she wasn't looking. The corners seemed darker, the walls more distant. Even the floor beneath her feet felt thinner, as though it might give way if she stood still too long. But Aika didn't fall. She had already been falling for weeks. The bell on her wrist was no longer bound. She had stopped trying. Each time she removed it, it returned by morning, as though her body had accepted it, like skin accepting a scar. It no longer felt foreign, it felt inevitable.
She moved through the house without sound. No longer Aika, not yet fully Mizue. Something in between. Something remembered. She lit the altar candle for the last time. Its flame flickered once, then stood still, unnaturally still, as though the air had stopped moving around it. Her grandmother's photograph sat beside Mizue's, and beneath it a sealed letter, one Aika hadn't seen before. She opened it with fingers that no longer trembled. My dearest Aika, if you're reading this, then I am gone, but I suspect you've already felt that. There are truths I carried too long, truths I hoped would die with me. But the dead are not generous. They do not keep secrets. You've likely uncovered the names, the patterns, the choosing. But there is one truth I never told you, because I never had the courage to speak it aloud. I was meant to go down there. They chose me when I was 16. I was born in the Tsuchinoe year, just like Mizue, just like you. But when the bell came for me, I refused. I ran, and they gave her instead, my younger sister, your great aunt. She didn't scream, she didn't beg, she just stared at me as they took her. She said only one thing, remember me. But I didn't. I buried her name with the others. And now, it has come back for you. Forgive me. Aika stared at the letter for a long time. Then, slowly, she folded it shut and placed it in the fire. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply listened as the bell began to ring again, not in warning, in agreement. Later, she walked to the shrine. The forest was quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The door of the shrine stood wide open, windless. Inside, the altar had been stripped bare. At the center of the floor, a single wooden box. No lid, no rope, just the shape of it. Waiting. She knelt beside it and placed her hand on the edge. It was warm, like skin. Behind her, she felt a presence, not hostile, not vengeful, but tired. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She whispered, "You were never the curse." The air shifted, and in the stillness, she heard Mizue's voice again, quiet, but closer now. No longer behind her, no longer above, inside. Then give me what they never gave. Aika closed her eyes and saw it again. The line of girls, one by one, chosen, silenced, buried. Not for protection, but for forgetting. And then came the final truth. There had never been a way to stop it, only to shift it. To survive, someone else always had to go, a soul for a soul. That's how her grandmother lived. That's how the priest lived. That's how the village endured. Sacrifices made in quiet, secrets buried in soft earth. Each generation pretending the curse was gone, when all they had done was give it someone new. Aika rose from the floor of the shrine. She stepped out into the clearing, the bell chiming gently against her wrist, and she whispered the only thing that could be said. No one else. No more daughters. No more sisters. No more girls forgotten by the roots of the mountain. It ends with me. That night she returned home one last time. She lit every candle. She opened every window. She played the bell like a lullaby, and she waited. In the early hours before dawn, the house trembled. The air grew thick. The mirrors fogged and cracked, and the voice that had once whispered spoke. Then come. Aika stood. and followed the sound beneath the floorboards, back into the earth, back to the grave that had waited not to take her, but to receive her. Because only the willing can break the cycle, and only the seen can rest.
The rain fell like threads of glass, cold, weightless, soundless. Aika walked barefoot beneath it, the bell tied to her wrist, ringing softly with every step, not in fear, not in warning, but in rhythm, a quiet, deliberate cadence, like the final chapter of a song. She didn't bring the journal. She didn't need candles. She didn't look back. Everything behind her had already been buried. The shrine stood open under the silver sky, as if it had been waiting for her since the day she was born. The ropes were gone. The paper charms had long since rotted into the soil. Even the wind didn't pass through the trees anymore. It was as if the forest understood this was the end, and it had chosen to be silent. She stepped inside. The air was colder here, but not lifeless. It felt like breath before speech. At the center of the shrine was the pit, the same space she had uncovered beneath her own home. But this time, there was no dust, no rot, no bones, only darkness. And the bell, resting at the edge, waiting. She picked it up. It rang once, then twice, then again, and with the third chime the earth shifted. From the far corner of the shrine, the paper wall peeled away as if stirred by an invisible hand. The shadows behind it deepened, then moved. A figure emerged. She did not float. She did not crawl. She walked, one step, then another. Bare feet, dirt-stained, silent. Aika stood motionless as Mizue entered the shrine, not as a spirit, not as a memory, but as a form that bled sorrow from every pore. Her white kimono dragged behind her like fog. Her hair hung long and wet, as if it had never dried since the moment they buried her. Her face was pale, untouched by time, but her eyes, they were not eyes made for seeing. They were eyes made for remembering. Mizue stopped in front of her. The two stood like reflections, one of flesh, one of ash. And then she reached out. Aika did not move. The fingers touched her face, cold and slow and trembling. Mizue's lips parted, and for the first time, sound passed through them. Not a scream, not a whisper, a voice. "Did you come to bury me again?" Aika shook her head. "No." "Did you come to bind me?" "No." "Then why are you here?" Aika stepped forward, placing her forehead gently against Mizue, a gesture of reverence, not fear. "I came to remember you, so you don't have to keep asking to be seen." Mizue's form wavered, not as if to vanish, but as if breaking open, and from her chest spilled not blood, not mist, but a sound, the echo of every bell that had ever rung in the dark, every chime made by every girl who had been lowered into the ground without goodbye. The air filled with it, the shrine trembled, the floor cracked, and Aika dropped to her knees overwhelmed, not by fear, but by grief. Mizue knelt beside her, and they wept together, the living and the dead, side by side, undistinguishable. Until, finally,
Mizue's voice returned, softer now, like a child. I remember the river. Aika nodded. And the boy. They said it was shame. It wasn't. They said it was sacred. It wasn't. They said I had to be erased. Aika met her eyes. You don't anymore. The wind returned, gentle as breath. The shrine grew brighter, not from light, but from the absence of shadow. And Mizue began to fade, not with agony, not with rage, but like a dream that had finally been told. She smiled, a small, trembling smile, and reached for the bell on Aika's wrist. But Aika stopped her. No, she whispered, you don't carry it anymore. She untied the bell and placed it in Mizue's hand, and for the first time, it did not ring. The floor cracked open behind them, revealing the earth's mouth one last time. Mizue turned to it, stepped forward, and looked back just once. Will you remember me? She asked. Aika closed her eyes. I will be you. And with that, Mizue stepped into the dark. The pit closed, and the shrine fell still. Aika stood alone. The bell was gone. The air was quiet. The past had been heard, and the girl in white was no longer beneath the earth, because she was no longer forgotten.
The morning after, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. No fog, no rain, no sound, just stillness, the kind that doesn't weigh, but lifts. Aika woke in her futon. The floor beneath her was firm, dry, silent. The bell was gone. Not in the room, not tied to her wrist, not in her bones. She sat up slowly, as if her body remembered how to move again only after permission had been granted. Her breath came without resistance. Her name felt whole. She stood in the doorway and looked toward the woods. The path to the shrine was overgrown, ferns curling over the stones, moss beginning to reclaim the steps. No wind stirred the trees. It was as if the forest too had exhaled and was finally allowed to sleep. She didn't go back to the shrine. She didn't need to. That door had closed, and what it once held no longer lingered. Later, she made tea for herself and for no one else. She placed a second cup at the table out of habit, not grief, not longing, just memory, a gentle, steady honoring. She cleaned the house with deliberate care, washed every surface, replaced the altar cloth, swept the ashes from the corners. The mirror was whole again, its reflection clear, true. When she looked into it, she saw only herself, not Mizue, not shadow, not echo, just a girl, a woman, still standing. The villagers noticed. A few began to meet her eyes again. One left rice at her door. Another nodded as she passed, slow, respectful, as if bowing to something they could finally begin to understand. The curse was not lifted, but it had been carried, and that made all the difference.
On the 7th day, Aika walked to the plum tree. The soil was soft where she had once buried the bell. She knelt there, hands empty. No digging, no tears. She simply whispered into the ground, "Thank you for waiting," and rose. That night, she lit a single candle. No prayers, no chants, just flame. She sat in silence until it flickered out, and for the first time in generations, nothing followed. No breath behind the walls, no fog on the mirror, no footsteps beneath the floor. Just silence, a silence that didn't threaten, a silence that held. But as she closed her eyes, she thought she heard it. Faint, distant, not behind her, not around her, but within her. A soft bell, not ringing to claim, not ringing to haunt, but to remind that remembering is a kind of release, and that sometimes the silence is where the story truly begins.